I'm Kathy LaSauce. I was born in Queens, New York, but I grew up on Long Island and retired from the Air Force in 1992. I went to Ithaca College in upstate New York, and in those days women were not architects, women were not pilots, women didn't dream of doing any of these non-traditional fields. It was during the 60s, many of my classmates were being drafted for Vietnam. When I graduated from college in 1971, I looked into joining the Air Force. Back in those days, the only way a woman could get into the United States Air Force as an officer was through a 12-week indoctrination program, which taught you things about poise and putting on makeup, and it was a real shock because I went from mini skirts and high boots to granny shoes and a really funky long skirt dress uniform. As women Air Force officers, they called us WAF, we had to march as a separate squadron. We were not allowed to do the small arms training or obstacle course, but you could see the Air Force was starting to realize that women were the answer to shortfalls throughout the non-combat fields. I felt pretty lucky that I was selected into the Air Force. I was in the first group of women trained as aircraft maintenance officers, and we went out to Chanute Air Force Base, and the men really didn't like having women in the class. It wasn't until I got to my first duty station at Travis Air Force Base, where I was in charge of about 120 maintenance personnel, all of which were male, and 40 C-141s. They didn't have a uniform that was appropriate for women on a flight line, so the Chief of Maintenance made the decision to authorize me to wear the men's fatigues and the men's steel-toed combat boots. And it surprised me when it even made the paper. Travis has a WAF, flight line maintenance officer. I didn't quite realize how unique this was at the time. While I was at Travis, flight crew, I would jump on the airplane to sign the exceptional release, and they'd kind of look, and a 22-year-old woman boarding their aircraft, what do you want? And well, without my signature, you're not going to fly. But it was kind of a unique situation to be in. After that, I wanted to be more of the war effort. Well, the women were not allowed in combat, although the Vietnam nurses certainly were. So I was sent to C-130 school, where I learned how to run engines, and they sent me to Guam, where I was in charge of the men of the Typhoon chasers. While I was on Guam, legislation was enacted to open up the Air Force service academies to women. A test program to explore the possibilities of women flying airplanes. And it was pretty amusing, I thought, but I applied and was really thrilled when in July of 1976, I was among the class of the first women selected to train as Air Force pilots. After my first solo flight, the little certificate that was presented to me was rather amusing because they crossed out the his and made a her solo flight. Our first airplane when we got to Williams Air Force Base was to fly the Cessna T-37 aircraft. And you just haven't really experienced life until you get to fly in a jet airplane and do maneuvers where you're doing loops and rolls. And then we went on to fly in the T-38 supersonic aircraft, an aircraft that could go Mach 1.2 and fly formation, wingtip to wingtip. At the time, I was 27 years old and a captain. The men really didn't want us there, but we gradually had to prove that women could be really good pilots. And once you fly wingtip to wingtip on a check ride with another pilot who thinks he's God's gift to the aviation, and he realizes that you outflew him, it didn't take long for them to realize that we were pretty good pilots. As we approached graduation, the list of airplanes that we would be allowed to fly did not include the C-141. It was too close to the combat zone, but luckily they opened the C-141, and I felt extremely fortunate that I got to go to an airplane that I felt comfortable with and fly the 141 at Norton Air Force Base, California. I had a commander who was very supportive, Colonel Dwayne Cassidy, who ultimately became a four-star general. I had the opportunity to fly early on with him. I had never taxied the 141 before, and it made the news, when I was, the first female C-141 co-pilot in the Air Force. And it was considered a really big deal back then. I had an aircraft commander check ride. Well, my 10-day mission around the Pacific, we had so many things go wrong, so many malfunctions of the aircraft, weather problems. The loadmaster, when he was interviewed, when I came back, said the only emergency she didn't have was ditching in the ocean. And that made the paper. And it's probably one of the best things that could have happened to me was having all these malfunctions, because not only did it build my self-confidence, but it built the confidence of the men that I flew with, that you have nothing to worry about flying with LaSauce because she's a good pilot. So it paved the way, and I was a good instructor. I upgraded to instructor pilot. I was promoted below the zone to major. They were going to give me another desk job. And I explained to the colonel, I said, all the women after me are going to be watching to see what happens. I've already had 5 years of maintenance. I want to fly in the Presidential Support Squadron at Andrews. It was a very prestigious unit. They had never led a woman. But I got to fly the VC-135, which is a specialized version of a Boeing 707. We had the squadron of all of us SAM pilots. They called it Special Air Mission Pilots. After that, I got ill. It was very heartbreaking that I was no longer physically qualified to fly because I was being looked at to command a flying squadron. Ultimately, I went to a staff job in the Pentagon, thinking that my dream of being a commander was over. But there were some people in key positions in the headquarters that decided that the best person to command the aerial port squadron at Andrews would be Kathy. I didn't know then, oh wow, I'm finally in some field where they have women. No, I was the first woman to actually command an aerial port squadron. And we were very highly qualified. I basically considered them the elite enlisted of the Air Force. They were vetted, they made sure that they were good at what they did. And it was just such an exciting career for me to be in command of that squadron. And normally, you only got to command a squadron for a year. I wrote to a board and said, I think I can do more in this squadron. Please do not select me for senior service school. Of course, my bosses didn't know I had written this letter, and I wrote it again. So I got 3 years to command the aerial port squadron. This was now an Air Force where you had women and men, in some cases, husbands and wives that were both serving. So it added a whole new perspective to deployments and what women could and couldn't do. And women were loading airplanes, they were fixing airplanes, we were flying airplanes, and we were commanding squadrons. And I basically feel very blessed that my career in aviation started breaking barriers little by little, and I was thrilled. I look back at myself, when I was in 4th grade, I wanted to play the trumpet, and they said, girls don't do that. And I wanted to be the drum major of the marching band, and they said, that's for guys. But I never felt uncomfortable to be the only woman. Okay, here I am at Chanute, and oh yeah, there's a couple of women. And then I go to Travis, you're the only woman. And my sister, even when she came out to visit at the 89th, said, aren't you uncomfortable? And I said, why? She said, you're the only woman in the entire building. Don't you? I never noticed. But I always try to maintain my femininity. Just because you're doing what has been traditionally a man's job does not mean you need to lose your femininity or your identity. You know, I've never really felt special, but I always felt that I had a mission or a purpose, that it was my responsibility not to be a good pilot, but to be the best pilot. And when I flew on a wingtip with this guy who thought he was God's gift to aviation, and I was a better pilot, they went, whoa. when President Reagan left office. I'm proud of this because I said, you know what? We're the ones that support the president. We should have a section for my squadron to be right there for the activities. I'm getting emotional, but it was so special that when President Reagan got off the airplane, he saw people that had been taking care of him his entire time as the president. I got his last salute and a wink. That was a very special time for me. And I think the people in the squadron appreciated that because they are the ones that supported the president. Women that are capable of doing the job should be allowed to serve the nation. And now, I don't know what the statistics are, but it's just amazing. So many of the fields are filled with women Marines and women that have trained as SEALs. In Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and as you know, nowadays, women are just as much in harm's way. In the 141s, we brought the POWs home from Vietnam. And the Aerial Port Squadron, we brought the POWs home from Iraq. And women are now in harm's way. They asked me if I would go and speak to Congress around 1991, and I said, you know, you have younger women who are mothers that are flying. Those are the women you need to bring to Congress to talk about the role of women as they are expanding us in all the fields, including combat fields. It saddens me to learn there's still people that are not accepting women and blacks and Hispanics. And you know, it's important because we're a very diverse nation. We were made up of immigrants, and now even more so. I don't really miss it because I know I've pretty much done it all. I got to do some pretty special things at some special times. I think takeaways from my career is that you really can do anything you set your mind to, that with hard work, determination, motivation, personality, you know, you can't lose yourself. Just because you're in a man's world in men's clothes, you can't lose your own identity. And I think sometimes folks don't realize that you can still be a woman in a combat, in a ditch next to a guy, but you're still a woman. I was in Dublin recently with my husband at a bar watching World Cup soccer. It was Russia against Spain, and there was a gentleman from Russia with his daughter in a, oh, it's okay, in a bar. And I went by and I said, you know, you can be anything you want to be. Well, her dad looked me up on his phone and went, whoa, you're in Wikipedia, look at here. And they were more interested in hearing about me than they were in watching Russia beat Spain. And the guy came over to my table and said, yes, I can watch Russia play soccer, but I can't have my daughter talk to the first woman Air Force pilot. And I thought that was pretty cool. Everybody calls this a hero picture.